Ways of studying the brain. So you have scanning techniques, which includes fMRIs, EEGs and ERPs, and it's important that you know that they are scanning techniques. And then you have a fourth way of studying the brain, which is post-mortems. So it's important to make that distinction between studying, scanning and studying the brain, because there have been times when they've asked specifically for scanning techniques and students have talked about post-mortems, which isn't a scanning technique, it's just a way of studying the brain. So functional magnetic resonance imaging, so fMRIs. Now they measure changes in the blood flow and the oxygenation of blood in parts of the brain. So they indicate that there's been an increased neural activity. So that's because when an area of the brain is active, it needs more oxygen and blood flow to be directed to that area of the brain. Now, fMRIs are particularly useful for identifying areas of the brain that are involved in particular mental activities. Now the strength is they're non-invasive, so they can be used to measure activity without causing any harm. So unlike other scanning techniques such as PET scans that use radiation, so there isn't any harm that could come about to the person. They have high spatial resolution, so you can really identify which specific areas of the brain are responsible for certain behaviours. So within millimetres you can identify that this part of the brain is responsible for that behaviour, that thought process. It's more objective than relying on verbal reports from participants, and it's particularly useful for studying non-verbal phenomena, so people might not be aware of certain thought processes that are going on in the brain. So it doesn't measure neural activity directly, so data can be misinterpreted. Also, it has really poor temporal resolution, so 5-second delay, so it might not be a true representation of moment-to-moment brain activity. So it's only after sort of 5 seconds that you see that that area of the brain has been activated. So is it really that you're measuring that brain activity at that moment to that stimulus, or are you measuring something else? So it could reduce the validity of the research. So EEGs, so they measure the electrical activity in the brain through electrodes placed on the scalp using a skull cap, and they show brain waves over time. The scan records the brain waves patterns from millions of neurons to show the overall brain activity. So they're often used as a diagnostic tool for unusual arrhythmic patterns, and they can indicate neurological abnormalities such as tumours, epilepsy and Alzheimer's. So they record brain activity in real time, so researchers can monitor responses to the task. They have good temporal resolution. They're useful for clinical diagnosis, so epileptic seizures give characteristics, they give spikes on the EEG data. You can't detect activity within the deeper brain regions such as the hippocampus, so it's not particularly good at searching areas of the brain that are right within the centre of the brain. Also, you can't pinpoint the exact source of the activity due to the electrodes being placed on the head. There could be overlapping areas, so therefore it might not have good spatial resolution either. ERPs, event-related potential, so this is using the data from the EEGs and you're isolating a specific event. So the ERPs are a type of brainwaves triggered by a particular event, so you're looking at that data, but the difference is that ERPs are in response to a stimulus. So sensory ERPs occur at the first 100 milliseconds after a stimulus, whereas cognitive ERPs are generated later. So a strength is that it's continued measures of processing in response to a stimulus, so we get quantitative data, and it can measure brain responses without the need for behavioural responses or speech, so it might be quite useful again for measuring non-verbal behaviours. But it requires many repetitions to gain meaningful data, and also it's really quite difficult to reduce the risk of background noise or extraneous material being picked up by the data and being analysed. So you've got to be careful that what you are measuring is actually in response to that stimulus. Post-mortems then. And this is a way of studying the brain, not scanning the brain, so it's important to be aware of that. So researchers may study a person who displayed behaviour while they were alive that suggests that they had an underlying brain damage, such as Broca with Tan, so he investigated his brain when he died. When the person died, the researcher can examine their brain and look for abnormalities that might explain their behaviour, which aren't found in controlled individuals. So it's like cutting open the brain, doing a dissection and looking for abnormalities within their brain structure that could influence or suggest brain damage and why they displayed that behaviour. So brain tissues can be examined in great detail, and the deeper structures of the brain can be investigated, so unlike ERPs and EEGs. Changes in neurotransmitters can also be measured, so abnormalities associated with schizophrenia. But it's only retrospective data that can be collected. It's too late to retest the person for cognitive functioning because they have passed away. So you're based on retrospective data, which might not be that objective. So in terms of some questions, we have EEGs and ERPs are both involved in recording the electrical activity of the brain. Outline one difference between EEGs and ERPs. So EEGs would cause the general brain activity. So remember, millions of brainwaves are recorded from neurons, and it's the overall pattern and activity that is measuring. So usually in response to sleep, whereas ERPs are in response to a specific stimulus that is presented to the participant, the person that's being studied. Outline and evaluate one or more ways of studying the brain for 16 marks. So for this one I would structure it in terms of AO1 for one way of studying the brain, then AO3, then my AO1 again, my AO3, AO1, AO3, rather than doing all of the AO1 together, and then the AO3 I would separate it into per scanning technique or studying technique, and focus on the AO1 as one paragraph for that technique, and then evaluating it and then moving on to my other ways of studying the brain.